In October 1806, the War of the Fourth Coalition began when Prussia, wanting to reassert its authority in Central Europe, declared war on France, who by this point had control over the region. Emperor Napoleon's 180,000-man strong Grand Army had wintered in southern Germany and was quick to respond. On the 8th of October, the French crossed over into Saxony, where they faced the main Prussian army at the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt. The Prussians, despite having more men than the French, were soundly defeated. For hours after the battle, the retreating Prussian soldiers were mercilessly pursued and cut down by the French cavalry reserve under Marshal Joachim Murat. The Prussians suffered almost 41,000 casualties. On the 25th of October, French soldiers entered the Prussian capital of Berlin, forcing King Frederick William III of Prussia to flee to the safety of Königsberg in East Prussia. Though the Prussians refused to admit defeat, they had effectively been knocked out of the war. Russia now had to face France alone, and by the 18th of November, French forces under Louis-Nicolas Davout were marching from Eylau and towards Warsaw with their spirits high. When the French arrived in Poland, the local people hailed them as liberators. The Russian general Bennigsen currently occupied Warsaw with Russian troops. He was worried that French troops may cut off his position, so he abandoned Warsaw and retreated to the right bank of the Vistula. On the 28th of November 1806, French troops under Murat entered Warsaw. A month later, a significant battle developed around Putusk. Both sides suffered significant losses, with no clear victor emerging. But Russian General Bennigsen wrote to the Tsar that he had defeated 60,000 French troops, and as a result, he gained overall command of the Russian armies in Poland. Bennigsen resolved to retreat to the town of Preußisch Eylau, and there he would make a stand. Casualties at this indecisive battle were horrific, perhaps 25,000 on each side. More importantly, however, the lack of a decisive victory by either side meant that the war would go on. Eylau was the first time the Grande Armée had experienced anything other than complete victory, and the French troops had become severely demoralized. And Napoleon knew he had to give them a victory, and so he called upon his allies for reinforcements. Once the reinforcements had arrived, Napoleon was now ready to resume the campaign. He commanded around 123,000 infantry, 30,000 cavalry, and 5,000 artillery gunners. Napoleon was still unaware of Bennigsen's numbers and intention, so Napoleon sent a messenger to be captured by the Russians, carrying fake dispatches that claimed 40,000 French soldiers were preparing to attack the Russian rear. Falling for the ruse, the Russians retreated to their well-fortified encampment at Heilsberg, along the Alle River. Napoleon pursued. The battle was over an hour later, the French having lost 10,000 men without gaining any advantage. The Russians sustained around 8,000 casualties. Though the Battle of Heilsberg was a tactical victory for the Russians, they would have little time to bask in their success. Pressed by the approaching French corps of Louis-Nicolas Davout and Édouard Mortier, Bennigsen was forced to withdraw before he could be surrounded, and the French occupied the blood-stained Heilsberg Heights on 12th of June. On the afternoon of the 13th of June 1807, the Russian troops began the slow process of crossing the Alle River into Friedland. The Russians began to cross, but the process was a slow one. Once the Russian troops began massing on the other side of the river, the advance guard of Marshal Lannes reported seeing large numbers of Russian troops on the fields near the town of Friedland. Marshal Lannes engaged the Russians with the intention of fixing them in place until the main army could arrive. For 9 hours, the French fought against the Russians, and as the battle went on, Bennigsen was forced to commit more of his men to the fight. At 6 p.m., 3,000 Russian cavalry finally pushed Lannes away from the village. After Bennigsen pushed back the French, he was confident he could crush Lannes the next morning. He had to defeat Lannes quickly, as Napoleon was on the move, and if Napoleon reached the Russians before they crossed back over the river, the Russians would be trapped up against the banks of the Alle River. Early on the morning of the 14th of June 1807, Bennigsen had constructed 4 pontoon bridges across the Alle and was hurrying men back across the river. Lannes soon resumed his attack to pin down as many Russians as he could. The first elements of Napoleon's main army began to arrive on the scene. The Russian batteries greeted these new arrivals with heavy cannon fire. Lannes's objective was still to keep as many Russian troops on the left side of the river as possible. He had noticed that the Russian pontoon bridges lay far beyond Bennigsen's left flank, meaning that if he could cut the Russians off from the bridges, they would be trapped in Friedland between the French army and the Alle River. French Marshal Mortier's 8th Corps arrived, bumping Lannes's numbers up to 35,000 men. Marshal Grouchy was ordered to secure the French rear by seizing the town of Heinrichsdorf. Bennigsen now realized the gravity of the situation. Before long, Napoleon himself would arrive. His new plan was to hold the French off until nightfall, when he hoped to slip back across the river, and over the next few hours, the fighting died down. Shortly before midday, Napoleon and his staff arrived to relieve Lannes from command. The French now had 80,000 men and outnumbered the Russians. The Emperor's staff was divided over whether to resume the attack today or wait until the next morning. Napoleon spotted a weakness in Bennigsen's deployment. The Russian left flank was vulnerable to being pushed up against the river. Napoleon knew that he needed to strike sooner rather than later. He stated, "We won't catch the enemy making the same mistake twice." At 5 p.m., Napoleon ordered a concentrated attack on the vulnerable Russian left. Marshal Ney was to lead the attack through Sortlack Wood to attack the Russian flank, while Lannes continued to hold his center position. Marshal Mortier would deploy near Heinrichsdorf, threatening the enemy's right flank. At the head of 10,000 men, Ney advanced on the Russians in Sortlack Woods. Ney swept through Sortlack, clearing it within an hour. The French kept the momentum and advanced towards the river. The sight of the French troops emerging from the woods on the other side alarmed the Russians. Ney's men slammed into the Russian left. Hoping to save his left, Bennigsen launched a cavalry counterattack. This was initially successful, but reinforcements by the fresh French First Corps soon pushed them back. This French counterattack forced the Russian cavalry back toward the infantry, which had retreated and was in a disorderly position along the fields next to the river. Noticing the mass of Russians clumped together, the French began to bombard them with artillery. The Russian cavalry charged the artillery. The Russian cavalry was torn to pieces by the artillery, and within 25 minutes, some 4,000 Russian horsemen had fallen. Ney rallied his men and broke through the Russian left flank, charging into Friedland itself. Brutal hand-to-hand fighting broke out in the streets of Friedland. Meanwhile, Lannes and Mortier had beaten back a desperate attack from the Russian center and had countercharged, pressing the Russians back up against the river. Some Russians discovered a ford, which allowed enough of them to cross the river to establish a battery on the other side of the river. This battery provided covering fire, allowing Bennigsen to evacuate as many men as he could across the ford. The Russians suffered heavy losses in the disorganized retreat over the river, with many soldiers drowning. Farther north, the still unbroken troops of the right wing withdrew by using the Allenburg road. The French cavalry of the left wing, though ordered to pursue, remained inactive. By the end of the battle, French casualties numbered approximately 10,000 soldiers, while the Russians suffered at least 20,000 casualties. 4 days later, Tsar Alexander asked for an armistice, which Napoleon happily granted. The War of the Fourth Coalition had come to an end, and an uneasy Franco-Russian alliance was established, and Russia would remain at peace for 5 years until deteriorating relations led to Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812.